That toy plane dares to fly near restricted airspace? The F-16 pilot's laughter boomed across the radio. Above the clouds, a small aircraft shook violently, trapped between two menacing F-16. The brown-haired woman in the cockpit gripped her controls tighter, staying silent. As the F-16s prepared to force her down, a trembling voice broke through. "That's Red Falcon." The entire formation fell dead silent. Elara Stone was 31 years old, with long brown hair, a compact frame, and bright eyes that often avoided the gaze of others. She lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to the legend she had once been, flying a small propeller aircraft to deliver medical supplies and food to remote areas. She had once been a legendary ace with the call sign Red Falcon, but her combat records had been erased to cover up a classified mission that had cost her wingman's life. The guilt of that loss had driven her from military service into civilian obscurity. In the eyes of the military, she was just another ordinary civilian pilot, barely worth noticing as she flew her humanitarian missions in outdated aircraft that seemed primitive compared to modern fighters. The morning started like any other, with Elara preparing to transport critical medical supplies to a border clinic that served refugees fleeing conflict. Her small single-engine plane was loaded with antibiotics, blood plasma, and emergency surgical equipment that could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of people. As she crossed into airspace near the military border zone, her radio crackled to life with an official challenge from air traffic control. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons had been scrambled to intercept what appeared to be an unauthorized aircraft violation. The military radar had detected her plane and immediately classified it as a potential threat, standard protocol for any aircraft approaching sensitive airspace without proper clearance codes. "Unknown aircraft, you are approaching restricted military airspace," came the crisp, professional voice of the lead F-16 pilot. "State your intentions immediately." Within minutes, 2 gleaming F-16s appeared on either side of her small aircraft, like metallic sharks flanking a minnow. The contrast was stark. Her weathered propeller plane looked like a museum piece compared to the sleek modern fighters. The radio exploded with mocking laughter as the young pilots got their first good look at what they were intercepting. "That toy plane dares to fly near restricted airspace?" The entire formation burst into laughter, their voices filling every frequency as they treated the situation like entertainment rather than a serious security matter. Elara maintained radio silence, her eyes fixed on her instruments, her hands gripping the controls with white knuckles. She had heard this kind of ridicule before, in different circumstances, but it never got easier to endure. The 2 F-16s moved closer, their massive forms casting shadows that nearly engulfed her tiny cockpit. The downdraft from their jet engines made her aircraft bounce and shake like a leaf in a hurricane. "Sit tight, lady," one pilot shouted over the radio with obvious amusement. "We're going to escort your little toy down to the ground where it belongs." More laughter followed, treating her like a joke rather than a pilot who might have legitimate reasons for being in the area. They saw her small plane and immediately assumed incompetence, never considering that appearances might be deceiving. A ground technician monitoring the interception through binoculars later recalled, "I watched her place her hand on the instrument panel like she was greeting an old friend. That wasn't the gesture of an amateur civilian pilot. There was something different about the way she connected with that aircraft." The F-16s began their standard intercept procedure, positioning themselves to force her toward the nearest military airfield where she would be questioned, searched, and probably charged with airspace violations. But as they prepared to complete what they assumed would be a routine forced landing of a lost civilian pilot, none of them realized they were about to encounter someone whose skills would challenge everything they thought they knew about flying. The morning sun climbed higher, and Elara continued to fly in enforced silence, surrounded by pilots who had no idea they were in the presence of someone who had once been the most feared fighter pilot in the sky. Elara found herself trapped in an aerial cage, with the two F-16s taking turns circling her small aircraft like predators playing with their prey. Their jet engines created turbulence that made her propeller plane buck and shake with every pass. The radio chatter continued relentlessly, filled with jokes and mockery that grew cruder with each exchange. "Look at that toy shake. Bet she's regretting her little adventure now." Another pilot chimed in with obvious amusement. "Maybe we should land her at the base and give her a job washing dishes in the mess hall." Clearly, flying isn't her strong suit. The young pilots treated the entire situation like a training exercise designed for their entertainment, never considering that the person they were humiliating might have feelings, responsibilities, or legitimate reasons for being in restricted airspace. Elara refused to respond to their taunts, keeping her eyes fixed on her radar display and her hands steady on the controls despite the increasing turbulence created by the F-16's proximity. She had learned long ago that engaging with bullies only encouraged them. Her small aircraft carried medical supplies that were desperately needed at a refugee camp just beyond the border. Children were dying from treatable diseases while she was being treated like a criminal for trying to save their lives. Suddenly, her radar screen lit up with new contacts that made her blood run cold. Multiple fast-moving objects were approaching from the border region. Armed UAVs that had appeared without warning and were closing rapidly on their position. The F-16 pilots' radar screens dissolved into static as advanced jamming systems overwhelmed their sophisticated electronics. The same technology that made their fighters so deadly in normal circumstances became useless against an enemy that had prepared specifically for this kind of encounter. "We're being jammed!" one F-16 pilot shouted in panic, his confident voice cracking as his instruments failed. "I can't see anything. All systems are down." The laughter died instantly as both F-16 pilots realized they were flying blind in hostile airspace, their million-dollar aircraft reduced to basic flight controls while unknown threats closed in on their position. The flight leader's voice cracked with fear. "We're locked up. Something has missile lock on us." In that moment of crisis, Elara switched to the emergency backup frequency and spoke with calm authority that cut through the chaos. "Falcon 1 on station." The radio fell completely silent except for the sound of labored breathing from pilots who suddenly realized they might die in the next few minutes. An older voice among the F-16 pilots, trembling with recognition and disbelief, whispered, "Red Falcon? That's impossible." The mocking laughter vanished completely, replaced by stunned silence as the implications of that call sign sank in. Red Falcon was a legend, a ghost story, a pilot whose classified missions had become whispered myths in pilot lounges around the world. The first UAV dove toward them with mechanical precision, its weapon systems locked onto the helpless F-16s. Elara pushed her throttles forward, bringing her small aircraft between the drone and its targets. Using techniques that predated electronic warfare, she maneuvered her propeller plane into the UAV's flight path, forcing it to break off its attack run to avoid collision. The drone's programming couldn't account for such an unconventional defensive tactic. The retention spike hit like lightning as Elara executed a dangerous spiral climb, pulling the UAV into a wind shear zone where its advanced flight control systems struggled to maintain stability. The drone's missiles fired wide, missing their targets completely. While the F-16 pilots watched in amazement, this small civilian aircraft was outmaneuvering military drones that had overwhelmed their sophisticated fighters through nothing more than skill and understanding of aerial combat principles that had been forgotten in the age of technology. Her movements were precise, calculated, deadly effective. Every maneuver served multiple purposes: defending the F-16s, positioning herself for counterattacks, and exploiting weaknesses in the UAVS's programming that only someone with extensive combat experience could recognize. A convoy driver on the ground later described what he witnessed. "We saw this tiny plane weaving between the military jets and the attacking drones. A woman's voice came over our emergency radio, calm and professional, and we all started crying. Someone was risking everything to protect us." The UAVs had been designed to counter modern fighter aircraft with their advanced systems and predictable tactics. They had no programming to deal with a pilot who fought like the aces of previous generations, using instinct and experience rather than computerized assistance. Elara's small plane danced through the sky like it was an extension of her own body. Anticipating the drone's movements and exploiting their mechanical limitations with an artistry that transcended mere technical skill, the F-16 pilots, their sophisticated aircraft reduced to basic flying, could only follow her lead and watch in stunned amazement as someone they had dismissed as incompetent demonstrated flying skills that exceeded anything in their experience. The sky became a battlefield where old-school flying technique proved superior to modern technology, where a forgotten legend returned to remind everyone that the human element remained irreplaceable in aerial combat. As the engagement continued, it became clear that the woman they had mocked was not only saving their lives, but rewriting the rules of air-to-air combat in real time, using principles they had never learned because they had never needed to learn them. The morning that had started with cruel laughter was transforming into something that would be remembered and whispered about for decades to come. The UAVs continued their relentless assault, their artificial intelligence adapting to conventional fighter tactics, but struggling against Elara's unconventional approach. The drones had been programmed to counter F-16s and similar modern aircraft, but they had no response protocols for a pilot who fought like the legendary aces of World War II. The F-16 pilots remained trapped in their high-tech coffins, their sophisticated systems useless against jamming technology that had been specifically designed to neutralize their advantages. They could only watch in growing amazement as a small propeller aircraft engaged multiple combat drones with techniques they had never seen before. Elara executed a perfect scissors maneuver, forcing the lead UAV to overshoot its attack run while positioning herself for a counterattack. Her small aircraft's machine guns, primitive compared to modern weapon systems, proved devastatingly effective against drones that had been designed to counter missiles and electronic warfare rather than old-fashioned gunfire. Her first kill came as she caught a UAV in a climbing turn it couldn't complete, its mechanical reflexes unable to match the intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that separated legendary pilots from merely competent ones. The drone exploded in a brilliant fireball that lit up the morning sky. The F-16 pilots watched in stunned silence as the toy plane they had mocked demonstrated combat effectiveness that exceeded their own capabilities. Their voices cracked with disbelief. "That civilian aircraft just shot down a military drone." The second UAV attempted a diving attack, using speed and altitude advantage that should have been insurmountable for a slower propeller aircraft. But Elara anticipated its approach, pulling into a barrel roll that used the mountain winds to gain both speed and positioning. She had learned to read wind patterns during missions that didn't officially exist, in battles that had been erased from records to protect national security. This knowledge, accumulated through years of classified combat, now served her in ways the UAV's programmers had never anticipated. Her second kill demonstrated why she had once been considered the most dangerous pilot in the sky. The UAV found itself chasing shadows, unable to maintain target lock on an aircraft that seemed to anticipate its every move. The explosion echoed across the mountains like thunder, sending debris raining down on the valley below where a refugee convoy watched the aerial battle that was determining their fate. The third UAV, recognizing that its companions had been destroyed, switched to a direct attack profile aimed at the helpless F-16s. Their pilots could only watch their radar screens show incoming missiles that their jammed systems couldn't counter. "We're dead," one F-16 pilot whispered, watching death approach on his display. Elara threw her aircraft into a power dive that should have torn her wings off, positioning herself between the UAV and its targets. She absorbed the drone's missile lock onto herself, drawing its weapons away from the F-16s at the cost of becoming the primary target. "Red Falcon, you're painting yourself," the lead F-16 pilot shouted, realizing she was deliberately sacrificing herself to save them. "That's the job," Elara replied with deadly calm, executing a maneuver that belonged in aviation textbooks as an example of perfect tactical flying. She led the UAV through a series of turns that exploited every weakness in its programming, using terrain masking and wind shear to create opportunities that didn't exist in the drone's tactical database. Her final shot was a masterpiece of deflection gunnery, catching the UAV in a turn it couldn't escape. In 15 minutes of aerial combat, Elara had single-handedly destroyed 3 military drones while protecting 2 F-16 jets, whose pilots had spent the morning mocking her capabilities. An older voice among the F-16 pilots, heavy with recognition and respect, whispered over the radio, "She's back. Red Falcon has returned." The young pilots who had led the morning's humiliation found themselves speechless, their throats tight with shame and newfound understanding of what they had witnessed. NORAD's command center, which had been monitoring the engagement through satellite feeds, broke radio silence with a transmission that carried the weight of official recognition. "Red Falcon, return to base. Outstanding work." The confirmation of her legendary call sign sent shockwaves through every pilot who heard it. Red Falcon wasn't just any pilot. She was a myth made real, a legend whose classified missions had become the stuff of whispered stories in pilot lounges around the world. As they approached the base for landing, the 2 F-16 pilots flew in respectful formation behind Elara's small aircraft, their roles completely reversed from the morning's arrogant interception. When they landed, the entire base was waiting in complete silence. Ground crews, mechanics, pilots, and command staff had all gathered to witness the return of someone whose existence had been officially denied for years. Elara taxied her bullet-riddled aircraft to the flight line, shut down her engine, and climbed out with the same calm professionalism she had shown in combat. Her small plane bore the scars of battle: bullet holes, scorched paint, and damaged control surfaces that testified to how close she had come to death. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, stepped forward with military bearing that acknowledged not just her skill, but her sacrifice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Red Falcon. From this day forward, no one on this base will refer to her as anything other than her proper call sign and the respect it commands." The young pilot who had led the morning's mockery walked across the tarmac with unsteady steps and dropped to one knee in front of Elara, his gesture witnessed by everyone present. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying across the silent airfield. "Please, teach me how to really fly." Elara looked down at him, her expression softening as she recognized genuine remorse and a desire to learn. "Tonight. Silent hangar. Bring a notebook and leave your assumptions at the door. The maintenance chief, who had watched the entire engagement through radar feeds, approached the colonel with shaking hands. "Sir, what she accomplished today, that wasn't just exceptional flying. That was something we don't see anymore, something we don't teach in our academies." As word of the mission spread through military channels, the story grew with each telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. The pilot they had dismissed as irrelevant had just reminded everyone what true mastery looked like when lives hung in the balance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base, and everyone who walked in them knew they had witnessed the return of a legend, whose time away had only made her more formidable. That evening, the silent hangar glowed with lights as Elara opened her first training session since returning from exile. Her small, battle-scarred aircraft sat in the center of the hangar like a shrine to the reality that skill mattered more than sophisticated equipment. Word had spread throughout the base about the legendary pilot's offer to share her knowledge, and the hangar filled with eager students who came expecting standard instruction, but found themselves learning about aspects of flying that had been forgotten in the age of computer-assisted everything. She taught them how to read wind patterns that instruments couldn't measure, how to maintain balance when electronic systems failed, and how to counter advanced threats using classical tactics that predated electronic warfare. "Never laugh at a small aircraft," she told her students during one memorable session, running her hand along her plane's damaged wing, or a quiet person. Both have survived things that would destroy louder, more impressive examples. The pilots who had mocked her that morning sat in attentive silence, taking notes as she explained combat principles that bridged the gap between historical air warfare and modern threats. They learned that technology was a tool, not a replacement for fundamental flying skills. The pilot who had led the morning's humiliation, whose name was Lieutenant Jake Morrison, attended every session with the intensity of someone who had looked death in the face and realized how little he actually knew. The atmosphere throughout the base transformed completely over the following weeks. The casual arrogance that had defined the squadron culture gave way to genuine respect for experience earned through combat, rather than simulator hours and classroom theory. Morrison became Elara's most dedicated student, arriving early to help set up equipment and staying late to practice the techniques she taught. His transformation from arrogant young pilot to humble student became a model for others who had similar adjustments to make. "The sky doesn't care about your confidence or your advanced degree," she explained during one evening session, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet hangar. "It only responds to genuine understanding earned through experience you pray you'll never need." Other military installations began hearing about the transformation at the base, and requests came in from pilots around the world who wanted to learn from someone who had proven that classical flying skills remained relevant in modern warfare. A metal plaque appeared on the hangar wall one morning, installed anonymously but embraced by everyone who read it. "Red Falcon doesn't need an audience. Only the sky needs to witness." The morning briefings became more serious affairs, with pilots asking thoughtful questions about scenarios they had previously considered impossible. The casual attitude that had nearly cost lives was replaced by professional focus and genuine preparation. One evening, as Elara dismissed her students after a particularly intensive session on emergency procedures, Morrison approached her with a question that had been troubling him since the morning's engagement. "Ma'am, why didn't you ever tell us who you really were? Why let us treat you that way when you could have put us in our place immediately?" Elara looked at him with something approaching warmth. "Would it have mattered? You had already decided who I was based on my aircraft and my civilian status. The sky was the only judge that mattered, and it rendered its verdict when it counted." Her response hit him like a physical blow, making him realize how much they had missed by judging capability based on appearances and assumptions rather than actual performance under pressure. The base became a model for military aviation training, producing pilots who understood that technology was a force multiplier, not a replacement for the fundamental skills that separated competent pilots from legendary ones. Comment: Red Falcon stands. If you believe that the quietest pilots are often the ones who truly guard the sky, Elara never sought to reclaim her former military status or demand recognition for her past achievements. She chose to remain in civilian service, quietly sharing her knowledge with those willing to learn from someone who had proven herself when everything was on the line. Victory doesn't come from the most powerful weapon, she told her final class of the year, but from the person who knows how to listen to the sky and respond to what it's trying to teach. This philosophy spread throughout the base and into the broader military aviation community. No one dared to underestimate civilian pilots anymore, understanding that appearances could be deceiving and that true expertise often came from unexpected sources. One morning, as Elara walked along the flight line preparing for another humanitarian mission, dawn spreading golden light across the aircraft, she flew and the base she had transformed. She reflected on how completely things had changed. Morrison approached her, his transformation from arrogant interceptor pilot to dedicated student complete in every way that mattered. His question carried the weight of genuine gratitude. "Thank you for saving our lives and opening our minds, for teaching us what flying really means." Elara pointed toward the horizon, where the sun painted clouds in brilliant colors. "I didn't open anything. The wind opened it. I just learned how to listen to what it was trying to teach, usually through painful experience I wouldn't wish on anyone." On the wall of the silent hangar, someone had added another inscription that became the unofficial motto of the transformed base. Red Falcon never needed applause, just the sky. The legend grew quietly, as the best legends do. When electronic systems failed in critical situations, when young pilots faced challenges beyond their training, when missions seemed impossible, veterans would smile knowingly and say, "If we need her, she'll be there." Elara continued her humanitarian flights and evening training sessions, passing on knowledge that couldn't be found in technical manuals or learned from computer simulations. She taught not just flying techniques, but the wisdom that comes from understanding your place in the vast complexity of aerial combat and human service. The base became a destination for military personnel from around the world, all seeking to understand the principles that had transformed a forgotten legend into an active teacher whose students regularly outperformed pilots from more prestigious programs. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of air combat training, they would point to Elara Stone as the pilot who reminded the world that human intuition and hard-earned experience remained irreplaceable, regardless of technological advancement. But Elara herself remained characteristically modest about her influence. "I hope I helped some people remember that flying is about more than the machine or the mission. It's about the responsibility we carry to protect those who depend on us." If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.